Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, we tend to assume that if we're working hard, we're working well. But what if that isn't true? Because if you think about it, we live in a world that's very good at keeping us busy, but not necessarily very good at helping us to be effective. My guest on this episode is Phil Dobson. He's the founder of Brain Workshops, a company that helps leaders and teams manage challenges like change by teaching what he describes as cognitive leadership. In other words, helping people to understand how their brains actually work and how that affects performance, decision-making, creativity, and resilience. In a wide-ranging discussion, Phil and I talk about why most of us are never taught how to use our brains effectively, why busyness and productivity aren't the same thing, and why some of our best ideas come when we stop trying to be productive altogether. We also explore attention, what Phil describes as our most valuable asset, and why modern working life often seems designed to fragment it. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably recognize that feeling of being constantly busy, slightly overloaded, and yet not always sure you're focusing on the right things. So this is a conversation about how we think, how we work, and how we might do both just that little bit better. It's my discussion with Phil Dobson on cognitive leadership. Phil, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thanks, Christian. It's good to be here with you. Thanks for having me on.
I'm very excited about the conversation we're going to have, but to allow us to do that so my listeners can get a sense of who I'm speaking to, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thanks. So I'm Phil Dobson. I'm the author of The Brain Book, the founder of Brain Workshops. So I specialize in what I call cognitive leadership, helping leaders apply neuroscience and psychological research to sustain their performance under pressure, to thrive through change and uncertainty, and ultimately use what we know about the brain to become more effective at work.
Let's start with a slightly challenging question. There's an implicit presumption in that they're not doing these things, that they're not very good at understanding the brain. Is that fair? And if so, why is that?
Oh, good question. Okay, so my assumption is not that people are doing things poorly. It's more a reflection on the fact that despite the human brain being the most sophisticated, most amazing organ in the known universe, and despite it being the primary conduit through which we experience all things, not just at work, but in life, it's remarkable how little any of us are really taught about it. And so what that means is we all make our own way through life and through work, doing our best. And my position is, if only we were taught a little bit more about our brain, and not just our brain, our nervous system, our psychology, how we operate as human beings, the human condition, then life will probably become easier. We'll probably be happier. We'll probably be more effective too, but I think it's a bigger conversation than just workplace productivity or leadership effectiveness. My position is the more we understand about the brain, the more we apply that to our lives, the happier, the more fulfilled we're likely to be. So my job, therefore, or the job I've ended up taking on, is trying to bridge that gap between the research, the literature of both neuroscience and psychological research, and turning it into very practical, real-world tips or models or techniques or protocols such that people can get more from their naturally amazing brains.
Love it. And how did you get into this?
Well, okay, how did I get into it? Well, I used to be a musician many years ago. I mean, I still love to write music and produce music and play the guitar, but a musician was probably how I would have defined myself and my identity back when I was in my 20s, I suppose. And then in 2007, I broke my ankle doing a handspring at a party. Now, that's perhaps a story for another time, but it became a really pivotal moment in my life. And at the time, I had a sales job that was kind of paying the bills and allowing me to spend a lot of time in my music studio. So in some sense, I was living a very rewarding life, I suppose. I was having a lot of fun, but there was a lack of fulfillment. I broke my ankle and it gave me about 15 weeks off, only because my job was in sales and so I couldn't get in the car and all this sort of stuff. It gave me a lot of time to reflect. And the combination of reflection and profound discomfort and pain ultimately led to a surprising decision, which was to go back to my roots of psychology. My degree had been psychology, and to start to study to become a clinical hypnotherapist. So that was the pivot. And I qualified maybe 18 months later. I set up a practice in Moorgate in the city, and I still live in East London now. And I started treating people with the sort of things you can probably imagine. So I found myself helping people with things like managing stress, improving sleep, modifying behaviors, improving confidence, things like this. And while it was immensely rewarding, it was intellectually challenging, it was all the things I think I wanted out of a job, I found myself becoming frustrated with this observation, again, echoing what I've just said, like, why are people talk so little about their brains? Because I was day in, day out observing how much some people were suffering just through this basic lack of knowledge that I learned in a fairly short space of time that I was translating to them in as little as 90 minutes, sometimes changing their lives. And so while my existing profession then, a clinical hypnotherapist, was rewarding, it soon became a different project to me, which was, can I deconstruct everything I've learned as a psychotherapist and teach it to other people? Because then they wouldn't need to see people like me anymore. And that's what really got me into neuroscience, because I wanted to understand the mechanics, the science, the literature behind why some of these techniques were so powerful, like what was really going on in the brain. That's what got me into neuroscience, and that's what began this kind of dual career at the time, hypnotherapy or psychotherapy on the one hand, and now starting to train people to run workshops, and brain workshops was kind of formed. Now, what's interesting at the time, because I was now self-employed, I was also deeply invested in trying to understand the science behind improving my own productivity. So again, neuroscience, I thought, well, if I understand about my own brain, maybe I can figure out the science of getting 8 hours work done in just 6 hours and go on holiday far more. So I started researching things like brain fitness, how things like exercise and sleep and stress all affect cognition, how the science of things like focus and mental energy can be applied to improve your daily productivity. And the more I applied to my life, the easier things I became. And it wasn't long before I was introduced to organizations. I started running workshops initially around a combination of productivity science and what back then was called stress management science. Now would probably be more likely called resilience training. And all of it was this same idea of taking the neuroscience or the psychological research, turning it into very practical real world skills that were highly effective in the workplace, helping people think and work smarter. And so that's more or less how I've been spending my last 15 years. And the topics I focus on, or the outcomes I help businesses and leaders achieve, has kind of evolved over the years. It was productivity and stress initially. It soon became creativity and problem solving, based maybe partly on the clients I was working with, people like Channel 4 and Viacom and very creative organizations, partly probably fueled by my own creativity. And more recently, just because all leaders seem to be navigating change, my research and the programs I now run, a lot of them are very focused on the science, the neuroscience of leading change.
Wow. Lots of things I want to pick up there, but one of the things that struck me is you talked about being self-employed. And I'll paraphrase here and tell me whether this is wrong if it is. Really, that removes excuses. And this really resonated with me because you said there, when you're responsible for 100% of it, there's no excuses, right? You can't sort of pretend to be productive. You know you're not being productive. You can't hide in meetings that are frankly not useful, but that's what's expected by the boss. There's no excuse for failure. And so I think there's something interesting there about you. In order for you to be credible in what you do, you have to live this stuff yourself. So you have to have worked it out, because it would be it's almost like it's an equivalent of a kind of fitness trainer that looks incredibly unhealthy showing up. You have to have it all completely sorted. And I guess working for yourself gives you the nudge to do that, because but also in order to sell what you do, to talk the way credibly about it, you need to be practicing this yourself.
Yeah, love it. Now, again, there are a few things I want to unpack there or underline. Firstly, you're right. You use the word excuses. It removes excuses, but it also increases the motivation to figure out working smarter, because the outcome is not just improved performance on behalf of some business owner that you're working for. I remember thinking about the maths. If I can figure out the science of getting 8 hours work done in just 6 hours, that's the equivalent of doing 12 months work in 9 months. And my goals very early on, sure, I had business goals and I used to think about certain targets, but one of my goals from day one was progressively increasing the amount of days or weeks I can have off each year. So the motivation, the drive, the incentive to figure out this science was much more profound for me because I had the autonomy, I suppose. The second thing, you're right. When you become self-employed, I suppose it might depend on the business, but one of the things that happens very early on is you understand the profound distinction between being productive on the one hand, getting lots of tasks done, versus being genuinely effective, right? So you understand the distinction between spending time versus generating real impact, right? So one of the very first books, I still remember this, it was possibly the very first day I kind of set out on my own. And I went to Victoria Park, which again, I still live down the road from, and I took the book by Tim Ferriss, The 4-Hour Work Week. Have you read it?
Yeah.
Okay, so he introduced me to the 80-20 principle, right? The idea that 20% of your efforts generate 80% of your returns, your value, your impact, your progress. That hit me hard. I mean, it's still a big part of some of the productivity training I do, helping leaders and teams be more outcome-oriented, right? More strategic, more impactful, and therefore less just replying to lots of emails and getting to the bottom of ever longer to-do lists. So it's a two-parter. You're right. Being self-employed gives you the incentives, but also changes your framing of what real productivity looks like, and it's grounded towards him. And then the third thing you mentioned, which I think you're absolutely right. My utility to the next team of leaders I work with isn't just a reflection on what are the books and what are the papers I've read. It's the degree of success I've had in encoding them into my own life, such that I can go, look, this really works. So historically, all of the stuff I've taught or facilitated or coached people with is things that I've found to be profoundly useful myself. And I suppose having the canvas of running your own business gives you greater freedom to run experiments and to see what works, such that you go, right, this actually I can share because it seems to have a profound impact on my productivity, my effectiveness, my creativity, my resilience, or whatever else I tend to be working on at the time.
Talk to me about the balance between experimentation and methods that work, because if you're experimenting all the time, argue that's quite high risk, but there needs to be that degree of it. How do you balance those two things between, here's let's call it workflow, whatever methodologies that work, but also I recognize that I don't want to be static. How do you balance those two things?
It's a really good question. I think that the way, at least I've operated, is, you read lots of stuff, you learn lots of stuff, and some of it makes sense at the time. Some of it reinforces what you're already doing. And every now and again, there's a nugget that you think, actually, I could start doing that. And then the experiment begins. It doesn't have to be a big experiment. It could be a very small little iterative test. And quite quickly, I think you can get a sense of the feedback. Is this working? Is it working for me? And so those sort of experiments, very low risk, happen kind of all the time. And I think all of us actually have some version of that, trying a new system, trying a new method, figuring out different times of how we plan things. I mean, we're probably all more iterative than we might realize. And then the second point, I suppose, is this idea of iteration over time. There would have been systems or methods or whatever I call it that in the past served me very, very well, that as you evolve, the type of work you do evolve, or just the character of work changes, what got you where you are won't get you to where you want to be. So things like, a good example, I suppose, is learning how to manage myself. I mean, I was an independent one-man band for many, many years. And I remember the very first time I took on an assistant. Now, I didn't really know much about things like delegation, despite working with leaders and managers talking about their own performance a great deal. So again, these things, when you're faced with a particular challenge, you have to go into problem-solving mode, and then your brain opens up to learning and experimentation and iteration and all those beautiful things that we all rely upon.
Love this. And clearly you're passionate about what you do. You mentioned earlier the idea of you were having fun as a musician, but fun didn't necessarily lead to fulfillment. And as I listened to you, I would have thought you have a lot of fun doing what you do. But you drew that distinction earlier on. I wondered again, as we look at sort of tensions, obviously we could be very theoretically fulfilled by doing boring things. There has to be that element of fun and playfulness. So how are you navigating that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, this is kind of philosophical conversation, isn't it, really? You've got hedonic well-being on the one hand and eudaimonic well-being on the other. And back in my days of being a musician, I had a great deal of hedonic well-being described by my day-to-day experience. I was getting a lot of joy. I was getting a lot of fun. There was a lot of playfulness. There was a lot of time with friends. I mean, I don't think I'm distinct here. I think many people just in their 20s, that's what they're doing.
Right? That's life.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, yeah. That's what youth should be described as, and having those characters where things like long-term thinking, for me at least, didn't really feature in my life. So yeah, very hedonic. Now, this idea of fulfillment, which we also understand in terms of having purpose, having impact, making a difference, often in someone else's life. In fact, often improving the well-being of others. You're right, that's a very different side of what we understand to be psychological well-being. And over the years, I noticed a kind of a lacking there. I wasn't really using my brain a lot, or I wasn't being challenged at all. The job I had was very easy, which in your 20s, if your primary daily goal is to get to the studio, that's brilliant. But then over the years, I mean, Daniel Kahneman talks about this, doesn't he? The experienced self and the remembered self. This idea that over years, when I reflected, I realized I wasn't really doing meaningful stuff. In which case, I feel incredibly lucky that this broken ankle happened, because although I had identified that I wasn't that fulfilled, I wasn't about to suddenly become a clinical hypnotherapist. I needed like profound physical and then emotional disruption that created mental space and perspective for me to do sufficient research to go, oh, look, there's this other path. So now you're right. I feel I feel very lucky that I get a great deal of the eudaimonic fulfillment. I mean, one way of framing what I do is improving other people's well-being. It might be grounded in leadership effectiveness, but as I've said, the more I help people understand their brain, the more likely they are to lead a more fulfilling, balanced life. And so now my task is to make sure that I keep adequate hold of the hedonic factors in my life, which for me are still music, right? Music's still a big part of what I do, but I have to be very disciplined isn't the right word, but I have to be very careful to make sure that on an average month or quarter that I'm spending enough time in the studio, because if I'm not very careful, busyness creeps in and I'm being really impactful and my eudaimonia is high, but that hedonic stuff, spending time with your friends, playing music, going to gigs, surfing is another big source of hedonic well-being for me. I need to book that in and I need to protect that stuff as much as any other meeting with any other person.
And talk to me a little bit about flow. I mean, I always looked at it sort of finding the rhythms that work for you and getting into the zone and all those kinds of things. And it strikes me that when you talk about what you do and also what you've just described, you sound like somebody that's really that understands yourself well. Do you find it easy to get into? Does flow come naturally to you?
I think it does, given the right conditions. So if we describe flow as that state of mental immersion where time distorts, if not disappears, you probably become quite unaware of your physical body because you enter this state of absolute immersive absorption. And often when it's studied, flow is described as this very kind of intellectual, kind of cognitive state. My initial experiences of flow, I suppose, were probably playing the guitar and in particular improvising the guitar. A very distinct experience when you're jamming with a group of friends. It's like collective flow. It's a profound experience that even to this day I've not really found a parallel for. So does it mean I'm easy to get into flow? I'm not sure. I'm very aware of the state because I've experienced it so many times in my life. So now when I enter a state of flow, and absolutely right, I'm doing everything I can to enter a state of flow, whether that's in order to create a hyper learning state, if I'm about to research, or a kind of a very profound state of presence when I'm about to deliver a workshop. You know, we all depend, I hope, on a state of flow. It is in order to achieve a different outcome. And the one thing that I think is highly relevant right now for us all collectively is how one of the biggest challenges to flow, i.e. a state of sustained attentional absorption, is how profoundly distracted and attentionally fragmented we've all become. So therefore, I suppose the challenges to me just like everyone else, of creating and maintaining flow becomes harder and harder given the character of modern life and modern work. Notifications pinging off and increasing to-do lists and inboxes. Many of us now have 6 or 7 digital inboxes with this kind of increasing pressure of, I should reply to all this sort of stuff. We check our phone as we get out of bed. We're probably still on a device in the last 60 minutes. Now, I hope I don't. I tend not to do that sort of stuff, but I know how common these things are. And I think you'd be hard put to find an environment that would be more in opposition to the state of flow.
And it strikes me that as you talk about flow and as you talked about the fact that we're not taught some of the things that you bring to your clients, it's almost as if we're designing a world that from the way we're taught at school, the sorts of things we're taught at school, the sorts of things we're not taught at school, the working practices, digital addiction, all of these sorts of things point in a direction of not getting the best out of us. And I guess if I was looking at what you're doing, you're sort of coming in and trying to remedy that a little bit and just going, actually, if we understood some of these things, because by implication, what you're doing is coming in saying there's a different way to look at the world. Here's some techniques that help us to navigate some of these things. But if I look at it, what you're up against is a heck of a lot of systems and structures, some modern, some old, that really don't help.
Yeah, 100%. And arguably, maybe even more so, do they not help? I mean, look at our collective relationship to things like our mobile phones and social media and digital technology, I suppose. And the correlative, if not, the causal link between things like the rise of anxiety, depression, and loneliness, and helplessness, and sleep deprivation. I mean, there's the great book, isn't there? The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt talks about this in quite a lot of detail. And I'd say the people who are particularly at risk here, I think, are younger people who maybe their brain hasn't fully developed yet, so they're particularly vulnerable. But this is something that parents talk to me about after running keynotes and things. I'm equally as concerned for the adults, for all of us, because you're right.
I'm okay with my kids. I'm really concerned about my kids. Well, have a look at yourself.
Yeah, how about modeling the behavior you'd like to see? And I'm deeply concerned, and this therefore becomes no longer a conversation purely around things like workplace productivity and little kind of brain hacks to make you more productive. This is so much more than that. It's a conversation about global mental health and well-being. It's about, there's a statement that I'm becoming more and more convinced of, which is our attention, or your attention, dear listener, is the single greatest asset you have. Right? Your attention is how you direct your brain. It is the entry point to the world and all experience you've ever had and will ever have. And your attention is under siege through digital notifications and inboxes and social media and so many other things. Things like AI, even more so. And so our attention, our brain, our mental well-being, and downstream of that, emotional and psychological well-being, even down to physical well-being when it affects things like sleep, we are fighting a urgent battle with this. And you're right, we're not really that well equipped. Not just neuroscientifically or evolutionarily do we have a lack of equipment for this, because our brains just didn't develop or evolve in this context. But you're right, we're not given any educative support either. We're not. Now, again, I'm 47 years old, so I don't have kids, so I don't really know what is being taught in schools as perhaps parent friends of mine. But I reckon you're right that we're probably not given enough information or skills, insights, and techniques to manage those demands, to regulate our emotions, to sustain our resilience, to take care of our bodies and our minds. Similarly, we're not taught any of the cognitive skills that I think are still, despite AI, hugely valuable. Things like critical thinking and problem solving, decision making under pressure. It's something that I know that you're, very invested in. Even things like behavioral design. Going back to my story of how I turned from a hypnotherapist into whatever I now am. One of the things I remember excitedly trying to convey when I was doing my early workshops was how little we're taught about our subjective experience and how much influence we can have on our subjective experience. And subjective is real. I mean, your experience, but the point is it's subjective. And all of the research about things like positive psychology or happiness, and even into modern day science of things like resilience and emotional regulation, so much is within your control. So to not be taught it is such a tragedy for the collective species and our collective well-being.
It's a very simple reflection, the attention piece, because it's sort of, what are you paying attention to? What are you allowing it? What data are you taking on board? It drives clearly what outputs there are on the other side of it. And I think it's such a simple way of looking at the world. And yet we allow ourselves to be manipulated and influenced and ignore and focus on things that aren't important. And it's such a simple observation. And yet that's the nature of the challenge. And I keep coming back to, we kind of all know this. On some level, we understand that we can change how we feel. We can, we can play ourselves a piece of music and be in a better mood as a result. Hang out with some fun people as opposed to some people that are rude to us. There are opportunities for us in very simple ways to deal with that. So we almost instinctively, intuitively know this. And yet I don't know if we trained ourselves out of it, where we never taught to think about this. Because what fascinates me here is that when you talk about these things, and I'm recognizing this is sometimes easier said than done, but in very simple ways, we all know that it's possible to have moments of joy from very small things, from who we hang out with. A flower might bring us joy, for example. And yet we seem to miss that trick. And so I love that all of your piece is leveraging off that really simple point.
Well, again, there are a couple of things there you said that I love all of it. This idea of being more in control or taking more ownership of what we let into our brain. If you think about one's diet, we're all pretty aware of the importance of monitoring and maybe choosing.
I'm aware of it, but I'm not.
Well, okay, maybe there's some.
But that's a start, right? No, but you can't do it if you're not even aware of it. So that is at least a necessity. I haven't quite got to the second phase of it, but I get what you're saying.
There is for sure a difference between knowing and doing, and we're all familiar with that, I'm sure. But this idea of diet and what you put in your mouth and digest, it will profoundly affect your physical well-being and your state and your health. And of course, the same is true with information and kind of digital diet. So I think there's something to underline there, that one should be equally as careful or intentional with what we just let into our brains. Things like, do you just check the news first thing when you get up? I mean, if you really were being meticulously self-directed with how you chose your neurological diet, I don't know how many people would still choose that as the very best time-tested option. But just coming back to your point, many of us do know our primary sources of joy, right? I mean, it's going back to this idea of hedonic well-being. Most people, if you say, okay, what are the things you love doing? What are the things that when you do them, you feel joyful or energized, or you get direct well-being? Or for some people, you can talk about balance, right? You feel out of balance. Well, what will give you more balance? And walking the dog, getting out into nature, going to gigs, listening to music, spending time with the people you love. We all know this stuff. One of the challenges, I think, for us actually calendarizing it is we're just too busy, right? So we have this, again, profound increase in not just this attentional fragmentation that I'm passionate about, but time poverty. Now, of course, you could say they're kind of one and the same. Coming back to this idea that time isn't your greatest asset, it's your attention, because you can waste time by being distracted. But one of the reasons we have no time is because we are spending all of our time on our phones, our attention's distracted, so that the flower you mentioned or the walk that we'd all wish we had more time for, exercise, is a classic example of things that we perpetually neglect or deprioritize because of our workload. And I suppose you're right that we know this stuff. And when we spend sufficient time reflecting on it, we'd probably go, actually, do you know what? I should make some changes. We'd certainly recommend that to someone we loved, but we're forever stuck in this. Do we apply that to our own life? Or do we, when push comes to shove, prioritize the workload, prioritize the busyness, and kind of, get back to our inbox?
And on that point, I mean, you're coming in clearly very, very, I haven't been to one of your workshops, but obviously it's going to be very, very super engaging. One, because you wouldn't be able to do what you do, but secondly, it just comes across in the way that you talk about this subject. It's obvious, and yet we're not doing it. How do you overcome that? Because I would have thought the risk is you come in and present a picture and say, wouldn't it be better if And not having been to one, I can sort of summarize what I imagine it would be like, and then you can tell me it's completely wrong. But you come in and sort of say, well, wouldn't it be good if we could have more of this in our lives? How do you then get people over that hump? Because we're our own worst enemy with this stuff, right? As back to, we know this stuff, and yet for some reason we manage to, and it's the brain that helps us to. I haven't got time for exercise today, or I couldn't possibly do X, Y, Z. We find the excuses. How do you overcome that bit?
Good question. Well, I think it needs to happen at more than one level. So the simple answer is encourage people to book it in their calendar, right? So thinking very behaviorally and practically. But as we've just identified, it's not the first time that someone's booked exercise in their calendar, right? So they've done that. They've got
New Year's resolutions all over, right? It's like
Exactly.
Logically this ought to work.
Right. So you need to change at a deeper level. I mean, deeper as if there's some sort of top-down hierarchy, but this is relevant. I work a lot with emergency physicians. Most of the work I do is working with organizations and the senior leaders within that. But I also work, ever since 2018, I work with the European Society of Emergency Medicine, helping emergency doctors not burn. And they are, as you can probably imagine, people or a community that are characterized by very caring people, very smart, very wanting to. People's lives are in their hands. So as a community, they will always prioritize the well-being of someone else over themselves, right? Part of their DNA. Now, the problem with that is over time, that leads to burnout. So saying something to an emergency physician saying, look, do you know you should prioritize, get some exercise in your calendar, isn't going to cut it until you help them reframe their relationship. You change their mindset such that they start to see themselves as their primary patient. Because if the primary patient themselves starts to burn out or falls, breaks, then all of their patients are screwed. But it does depend upon this. Let's think about it in a different way. What are your beliefs? What's your mindset? And how can we elevate that or shift that so that now you see, it's the classic, put your own oxygen mask on before you help someone else, right? When you think about it with a bit of space, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. That's sustainable. But when you think about that in a very busy week, when you're navigating lots of competing demands, we default back to our normal mechanism, which is like other people's priorities are greater than my own. And that's when you get this narrative of, well, I book exercise in, but I feel guilty because I've got all this stuff to do, or I've got all these patients queuing, right? Again, you can choose your population that we're using as the example. So you've got to change how people think. And if you do that sufficiently, then you'll change what people do, how they behave.
And in a way, what you've highlighted there is a good example of this principle of efficiency. And we can sort of think about productivity. The more hours we can get people to work, the better. And actually, we know that particularly when it comes to creative endeavors, actually doing nothing, not working, can actually produce some amazing results. Back to your 80-20. We've seen lots of examples of people who work very bloody hard but get nothing done because they're on that treadmill. And so I think there's something fascinating there about, as we look at some of the trends that I fear still seeing, but certainly have seen in the past of sort of businesses looking at efficiency and productivity, all these sorts of terms point towards, frankly, just let's get more work out of people. Yeah. And actually, I think what I think is really interesting about what you're doing is, one, recognizing the downsides that has. But second, if we look at what are people going to do going forward in a world powered by AI, and if you can give something to AI and reliably and sensibly, then that's probably worth thinking about. But that means people are going to be moving more into the realms of doing things that the AI can't yet or ever. So things like creativity,
whatever they are.
Well, yeah, so creativity, nuance, emotional intelligence, all those sorts of things. And that's kind of where productivity becomes less of a significant concept. In fact, actually being unproductive can actually yield better results. Having more time for people, having more creative input. So I think there's something fascinating here about you're up against conventional logic and sort of industrial thinking, I guess, when it comes to human labor.
Yeah, I love it. Absolutely right. So there are three things I want to reflect back to you based on what you said. Firstly, yeah, it's the distinction I've kind of already made, which is this profound distinction between task-oriented thinking and activity versus outcome and impact-oriented activity. So you're right. The root of productivity is just, lots of product. It's about N values. How many tasks can you get done on any given day? 15 is better than 10. And then you think, well, actually, no, it's not quite that simple, is it? Because not all tasks are equal. So if you think more about impact and outcome and value and meaningful work, then you realize sometimes getting 2 really high value tasks done is way better than getting 10 bullshit tasks, right? So there's that really important distinction. But then the second way I think that's useful, like again, this shift away from and to, is being less oriented towards time management and more oriented towards energy management. Again, the value you provide at your desk is not a product of how many hours you sit at it. It's also a factor of how much energy you bring to that. And also attention, which will be my third point. But the idea that having a break, for example, right? If time was the primary variable, then any break would make you less productive by definition. Well, we know that's not true. Just like sleeps are kind of useful every now and again, right? You have to think about your brain and it's how it's designed. And it's not designed to just be on for 8 hours a day. It needs breaks. Athletes know this. We know this from our muscular activity, but we kind of forget when we use our brain. So that's another thing to consider around. But the other thing that really, I think, kind of unifying your point here is this really profound distinction between creative thinking and productive thinking. And this is, we can explain it in terms of brain networks, but we've all had that experience of having a great idea appear seemingly from nowhere when we're about to drift off to sleep, or we've just come out of the shower, or maybe we're in a bath, classic Archimedes. Many of us, you're on vacation or you're on holiday. I get them when I'm surfing. Like, what's that about? Why is it that why is it that often your best ideas, those moments of clarity, insight, where suddenly you're like, I've been thinking about this all wrong, only happen when you stop working, you stop trying to be productive, and you realize, they're different things. And for those that are interested, the neuroscience, what's going on here, like your executive network is what we associate with task-oriented execution. Higher order cognition, sure, getting stuff done, strategic thinking, computation, all of that linear stuff, very time or energy consumptive. And then we go on a break, we go for a walk, we get into nature, we go on holiday, we have a glass of wine, we sleep. All of those things behaviorally might look very different, but what they all do is they shift brain networks away from your executive network towards what we call your default mode network. That's the part of your brain that inspires more lateral thinking, where the brain kind of becomes more of a parallel processor than a serial processor. It forms new associations. It extracts meaning. It starts to be good at things like information processing and consequently things like problem solving. And suddenly that's where you get these amazing ideas. So you're absolutely right. There's something here about, and again, this is something I try and get leaders to do, to acknowledge that when we start our careers, it's probably true that many of us are incentivized and our value is about the amount of work we do. And it doesn't take long before, no, it's not really that anymore. It's about the quality of the decisions you make. It's about the quality of your output, which now includes very intangible things, strategic insights or creative thinking, innovation. And the more they become the stuff that really matters, and I agree, there's an AI conversation here for sure, the more you realize actually the conditions under which they come online neurologically, it's not really sat in an office. It's probably not staring at a screen. It's certainly not thinking about time management or, being visibly productive from the outside world. It's when you give yourself permission to go, do you know what, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to have a glass of wine on the way. I'm going to come back and I probably will have a great amount of insight than, the insight would have taken me days sitting at my desk, just banging my head against a proverbial brick wall.
As I think about, and I've got in the back of my mind this desire to drag everybody back to the office, after the pandemic, as an illustration of this. But there is a sort of mindset amongst managers and leaders that is, I need to be able to monitor what they're doing. And of course, part of the reason that you would use, time spent doing things or not doing things as a metric is it's easy to measure. And therefore, what you all kind of almost say is you have to let go. If you want to get, reading between the lines here, if you want to get the best out of your people and yourself, you sort of have to let go a little bit, right? And we can't micromanage people's time in that way. Because if you do that, to your point, you're not necessarily getting the best out of them. Now, giving them zero management and zero supervision whatsoever is, of course, not the right answer. But there's an interesting thing here that you're probably asking them to think differently about how they lead. And I'm guessing that's cognitively challenging.
It's interesting. I mean, this is an echo of a conversation I had only yesterday with a client, and exploring how, you're right, measuring things in the workplace is not bad per se. But you have to be very careful of what it is you choose to measure. Because the minute you start measuring something, then you've changed, much like the scientist, you've changed the parameters of the whole experience in a way. So you've got to be careful what you incentivize. But then the other profound point that you're kind of pulling at is this idea that there are many things that can't really be measured very well. I mean, how do you measure, effective collaboration? How do you measure a sense of belonging? I mean, you can get people to score it. And so you can just do pre and post analysis. We've gone up from 7 out of 10 to 8 out of 10. Cool. But how can you measure it in terms of a quantifiable unit that's grounded in time? How many minutes this week have you spent belonging? It doesn't quite work like that. Or even thinking pragmatically, how many minutes have you invested in improving your sense of cohesion in your team, right? You could take that on as a project if you wanted, but there is risk there. Partly through it just might be a complete waste of time, but also because it's so nuanced, and this is the human condition, it's nuanced, it's psychological, it's complex. If you did try to deconstruct something like team belonging into a number of sub behaviors to then go, right, we're going to try and increase those 3 as priorities, it might just end up as a weird, not just weird experiment, but a very weird experience that you create for this team, consequently creating the inverse of the outcome you actually want. Like, what's happening? Why are we, so you got to be careful with this sort of stuff for sure.
And I'm struck that because of some of these challenges, the people that hire you, obviously on some level, have recognized that there's a need to shift. I mean, if people didn't want to buy, because you have to want to make change. There's no point in bringing you in to sort of throw things at you and say this is rubbish and not listen to it. I mean, I'm sure people could do that, but it's not great for you. Probably wouldn't. But there's an interesting thing here about someone within an organization has recognized this is an issue. And so I guess it may not be everybody that attends your sessions that's willing, but someone within that organization has clocked that this is a challenge and you have a solution to it.
Yes. I mean, I've found myself, just because I've been doing what I do for a long time, the problems that organizations come to me with is more than one. One of the things that organizations seek my help with that's certainly been dominant in the last 5 to 10 years is something that probably many of us can relate to, which is workload overwhelm. So saying, there are some people that don't need really do. I haven't met many yet.
Yeah.
This idea that we're all busier than ever, workloads are only increasing. We feel more time poor than ever. We feel maybe more distracted than ever. We're working longer hours than ever. We find it hard to switch off. That's then compromising some of the other stuff we've spoken about. I don't have time for things like exercise and sleep and stress and all this stuff. So if the question is, how obvious is it that some organizations need my help? Well, that's a pretty glowing example of a lot of people feel they realize that things could be done better in their organization. People need help prioritizing the stuff that matters, creating states of flow and absorption, mastering their workloads, and reclaiming their best brain to do their best work. And then, as I said, more recently, organizations are asking for help with this idea that leaders in particular are navigating, I'm not going to say unprecedented because that's probably not true, but very high and very sustained pressure, uncertainty, change, and ambiguity. And again, we're not really taught how to do this very well. And so therefore, a lot of people now realize that if we are ill-equipped to do this, and if we are seeing incidents of burn only increasing, well, what's the solution? And of course, there are lots of solutions out there, but understanding your brain, understanding the brain of your team, understanding the collective brain of the organization probably puts you in a stronger position to make powerful and lasting interventions because you know the science of what's really going on inside people's heads. And that puts you in a stronger position than all other things being equal, you not knowing that stuff.
I love this idea of actually, if thinking about how we think, how we see the world, that being useful throughout our lives is, of course, incredibly powerful. And it strikes me that when one looks at that, often many solutions are sort of workplace oriented. I was sort of said to our courses, working with respect as an example. And you kind of know what's coming when you get that sort of thing. And it's going to be in the workplace, we respect other people. We're straight out of the office type thing. And so it's always struck me as being funny because there's this implicit presumption that kind of people would, you walk in through the door, you log into the system and you become a different person. And so I love this idea that what you've got is sort of saying, actually, we need to address something that's relevant throughout people's lives because they're not different people outside the office. They may have to behave slightly differently, there are different norms, but it's that same human OS that's those things. And so I love the fact that what you're coming with is something that I guess it also helps people grab people's attention because this isn't just relevant to work, right? You're giving them a useful life skill that will go way beyond that. But that's necessary because to solve the in-work problems, we have to also start looking at things outside the workplace.
Interesting. So yeah, you're right. I'm lucky that when I do learning programs or workshops within business, that while I can make the case to the business or the head of learning development or the head of, the CEO or the head of HR, that there's a return on investment, right? I will make people more effective in the workplace. That's a given. But of course, the people in front of me, I'm giving them skills and knowledge that is their brain, that you're right, it's the same brain they're going to use when they go home. And so all of the skills or the benefits don't just exist between 9 and 5 and then suddenly, okay, much like, I don't know, getting better at Excel, you might not be that excited about doing it. You'll only do it when you're sat at your desk. So no, I'm very lucky that the work I do, it's getting the what's in it for me is high because everyone's got a brain and most people are invested in using their brain better and getting more from it. Yeah, in terms of your observation about how some of the solutions might be outside of the workplace, then yeah, for sure, we've got some work to do there too.
You talked a little bit about the sectors that you're working with. I mean, the beautiful thing here is this applies to everybody in every sector, right? As long as if you have a brain, this is relevant to you. If you don't, you're probably not going to work out how to get in touch with you anyway. So that's less of an issue. But are there particular sectors that are more receptive to this than others?
I've definitely found clustering happen in what I suppose broadly are creative industries. And I don't mean, advertising and PR, who seem to have kind of taken for themselves in terms of the ownership. But, my clients for a long time were the likes of Viacom, CBS, Paramount, NBC Universal, Channel 4. So, there was definitely clustering there. Financial Times became a client. I've worked with Google DeepMind. I've worked with Meta. So there's certainly there's some kind of thematic thing going on there, more than, for example, insurance or legal. Now, that might just be more a reflection on the fact that I'm very lucky that in our space, learning and development, people are very kind and they refer people on. And so it's probably more a reflection that the people who referred me on did so to a friend of theirs that worked in a similar kind of industry rather than a cross industry. But back to our point about creative thinking coming alive under certain conditions, I think my utility is probably greater to people who, or for whom, things like creativity, problem solving, innovation, critical thinking, decision making, they're part of their role as well as just getting to the bottom of a long, long list. But then, as I've said, I've been doing what I do for a long, long time, and I've ended up working with emergency doctors because you're right, while the kind of training ground, I suppose, for me of learning the science, turning it into practical skills for the modern workplace, it was very much experience within this, those organizations I've worked with. Just being invited to work in other organizations or other industries, you realize, back to your point, well, actually everyone's got a brain. And if I can help certain leaders improve their resilience, well, what utility can I have for an emergency physician improving their resilience and such not burning out? And then it becomes a bi-directional relationship. As I get better at helping emergency doctors not burn out, and I understand the very specific conditions under which emergency medicine happens, the particularly high pressure environment under which doctors need to make decisions, suddenly I become even more valuable to the next leader I work with, because it's like, look, if this works for emergency physicians, then I think it's going to work for you too.
Similarly, I've worked with pressure, right?
Yeah, exactly. Life and death pressure. Similarly, I've worked with pilots, the aviation industry, to help them also make better decisions under pressure. Because this is, there is not much margin for error when you're operating on someone or you're flying an aircraft. So it's, I'm very lucky, that I get to kind of work cross different industries. But back to your question, the kind of broadly creative industries are generally where I've done my most of my work.
And it was interesting as you were talking, because I thought actually that start point of those creative, if we took sort of TV as an example, the word talent gets used typically for on-screen talent. But nonetheless, there's a recognition that you've got that there is this human. I hate the word human capital because the focus tends to be on the capital rather than the human when people use that. But there is something interesting about that in that there is an understanding. And if I look at rock stars in the traditional sense, they get the rider that allows them to have the dressing room that's, yes, and okay, some of them use it as a sort of abuse of power or whatever, but it's to set them up to be best on stage, right? Give Elton John the flowers that calm him down or whatever. And so there is a view around nurturing people and getting the best out of them. And so I think there's something interesting there about starting in a space where that is at least for the people on screen or on stage is recognized, and then carrying that through, because we do see that word talent used in other industries. But of course, it's sometimes it's a convenient label as opposed to actually thinking through some of these things. So I think the transition you talked about sort of makes sense to me, recognizing, of course, that I'm now fitting a logic to fit the narrative. But there seems to be something in that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, whether we call it talent or we call it, capital or any of the other names that we've described human beings with, the bottom line is, for an organization or even a team of people, it's the people that are the greatest. And here I'm going to use another word that's probably misplaced, asset, right? If you're an organization, it's your people that are going to make you a success or not. And of those individuals, I'd argue it's their brain and their attention that is their greatest asset. So therefore, it kind of should go without saying. Anything you can do as a organization, whether you're senior leadership or someone who has influence over the experience of your people and their brains, why wouldn't you create optimal conditions for all of the things that are important to you? Productivity and creativity and decision-making and performance, like that whole thing. So now some organizations get that. So many organizations now do invest in things like learning and development, but also things like, well-being days and even things like office design, in order that people feel happier and they come into the office more often, right? So it makes perfect sense to invest in this stuff. And maybe that's actually more of a honest answer about why I've ended up working with the organizations in the industry I have. Because again, those organizations I mentioned, they've got it for probably longer than others, and they've invested in people better than others. And consequently, they get the most from their talent. Again, that sounds almost kind of Machiavellian, but like this is important stuff. People deserve to be invested in. People deserve to have learning and development, and for them to develop their brains and to master things on the job. And sometimes those things aren't just about making them better at their job, but they're more kind of globally transferable, as you said. So this is important stuff. And I do think it's kind of, organizations are waking up to this. Only this year, the Financial Times are launching I forget the name of it, but kind of a national recognition of companies that invest in learning and development, to be able to celebrate those companies that get this. Because learning and development isn't just in the interest of organizational performance. It's also in the interest of improving people's experience of work. And that's important.
And I guess sort of flipping the narrative into the world that I'm in is, you said that humans are the biggest asset. I'd argue they're also potentially the largest liability. Screwing things up. I always say there's always a human component involved, either causing the problem in the first place or making it worse by the way they react or typically don't react to things. And so I think it's often framed as sort of, how do we get get more out of our people? My view would also be, you can look at how do they make better decisions, but you can also look at the flip side and go, how do we stop them making bad decisions? Because actually that's a key component. And so it's less interesting to say. It's a little bit harder to sell in the sense of, well, let's talk about good things. We don't want to talk about the bad things that might happen. But I think, what you're pointing at is, if we're improving decision-making, we're hopefully making more good decisions and less bad ones.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So, human error has got a lot to answer for, right? And again, we can go back to the medical industry or the aviation industry. Well, there's that great book, Black Box Thinking, isn't there? Matthew Syed kind of comparing these two different industries and how the reason aviation is now so safe is because they've just invested a huge amount of time and effort in reducing or eliminating human error, done through very simple mechanisms, often right black boxes and then checklists and all this sort of very behavioral design, purely in the interests of stopping people make silly errors, because human beings are incredibly fallible. We perform very poorly under stress. We become very reactive. We become impulsive. We make bad decisions. We're also susceptible, of course, to things like fatigue, tiredness, conditions under which the brain isn't really built for. Back to this idea that we're now operating in a world that is not really that compatible with the context of our evolution. So our brain is under higher pressure. It's more fragmented. It's dealing with a level of pace and uncertainty that is putting us in this position of very impulsive, poor decision makers. So I couldn't agree more. Much of human performance or cognitive performance in the workplace, it's not just creating the conditions for this increase in certain things we value, productivity, for example, but you're right, decreasing the chances of us also completely sabotaging that by making a very poor decision.
Obviously, there are lots of organizations that need your help. That's very, very, very clear. There's some high profile ones, some ones we've never heard of. But obviously, to do what you do, you need to be sustained and fulfilled. And I don't just mean financially, although that's clearly a key part of this. But it says, wait, are you constantly evolving what you do and how you do it? And if so, where does the journey take you?
Yeah, interesting. I am. And it's recently happened. I've mentioned this idea of helping leaders use neuroscience to lead change. I mean, this is relatively a very new topic for me. As I've said, it began what I do with organizations anyway, a mixture of productivity and resilience, and helping kind of individual teams improve that. And then it evolved, and creativity and problem solving became part of that. And so I found myself for many years thinking about the outcomes as this one of three. It's productivity, it's creativity, and it's resilience, or sustainable high performance, right? It's those three. And then I suppose a couple of years ago, it would have been 2024 and 25, there's suddenly an increase in the desire.
I'm terrified that you said that's a couple of years ago, but you're
I
absolutely
know, right? It's weird. I mean, and the thing is, I might be wrong. It might have been 2023, but it was definitely in the recent past. An increase in people's willingness to explore shorter work weeks, right? Suddenly 4-day weeks are on the radar. So as someone who's spent years helping teams work smarter, suddenly I'm in a really good position. And again, I'm just led by my clients of mine who trust me and I've worked with for a long time, said, look, we're thinking about shortening our work week. We want to shave off half of Fridays. We kind of need your help. So suddenly, rather than just working at individual team level, I'm like, okay, well, let's take the whole organization through a program, and oh, look, it worked. So suddenly I'm challenging my own assumptions. Previously, I always thought optimal group size is maybe 12 or 15. And suddenly I'm doing webinars for 300 people, and it's having an impact that's sufficient enough that an organization can shorten their work week. Brilliant. So then I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe my new niche is the science of shortening your work weeks. Fantastic. And so again, I helped a number of organizations do that. And I love evolving. I love taking on new challenges and challenging your assumptions and, seeing what you do through a slightly different lens, purely facilitated by someone else's view of what you do and how you can really be helpful. And then most recently, the neuroscience of leading change. That was only, again, because a client of mine, a trusted client, someone who I've worked with in the past a great deal, helping their leaders work smarter, improve creativity and problem solving and productivity and resilience, goes, look, a group of our strategic leaders has asked for a change management qualification. But what I think would be more interesting is if you taught them the neuroscience of leading change. Well, great, bring it on. I think that's a fascinating topic. It's clearly very relevant, and I'm honored that you've asked. Let's do it. So that prompted what then became another passion and research project of mine, going deep into decoding the neuroscience and the psychological research behind leading change. So suddenly changing the focus, I suppose, from the leader being really effective and getting more from their brains to understanding this really fascinating, complex and nuanced topic of how groups of people respond to change, and how, again, if you can take a brain-based and people-centric approach to doing that, you're going to do so much better than everyone else. And as we know, leading, change initiatives, 60 to 70% of them fail. And my position now, having done a lot of research, is because we think in terms of strategy and communication. We don't think about how these messages are received. We don't think about the people and their brains. So here we are once again. I'll look back on 2025 and 2026 going, well, that was when I started to really focus on this leading change, not just, individual resilience through change and uncertainty, which has been part of what I do for many, many years, but now suddenly equipping leaders with this brain-based toolkit of skills to lead their organization through things like restructures and strategic changes and pivots and all that stuff. So yeah, it's again, I've said this a number of times on this conversation. I feel very lucky that I get to do what I do, that I get such fulfillment with what I do, and I have just the right amount of being able to specialize in something so I can get deep enough where I'm like, okay, this really works. And it works in a number of different organizations. I can change the context, but it still works. For example, pivoting resilience training from senior leaders to doctors, but then also just being led by clients' request and the ever evolving needs of the market. And suddenly, oh, look, collectively, we're all navigating things like change, uncertainty, and AI. And can I help there too? So yeah, it's an interesting one because whenever I speak to someone who's involved in marketing, I'm their worst nightmare because I don't really niche, right? And marketing is all about being very, very specific niche. And I'm like, well, that's, if I wanted to be very marketable, I'd probably say I just do this one thing, but that just doesn't light me up. I'm more useful being someone who's got a few different domains that I can help with, right? So not a complete generalist, but someone who has breadth of expertise. And therefore, when I do partner with organizations, I feel like I can bring more to the conversation and ultimately their leaders and their team through more of a sophisticated understanding of, well, what are their challenges with work at the moment, covering some of the stuff we've spoken about. Some of them are mentally overloaded, right? You need to understand that if you're going to lead change. Things like creativity and problem solving, that needs to be part of a successful organization, whether you're navigating AI and change or not. And again, resilience right now, it's rarely been more important to develop, to sustain your own resilience, adaptability, your ability to sustain your performance, not just through pressure, through change, through uncertainty, right? All these skills have probably never been more important.
And I love what you describe as marketing logic, because I recognize that it's kind of like you need to have your ideal client profile, avatar, whatever, and you do that one thing, sort of almost the kind of like smartphone app logic, right? Do one thing really, really, really well, focus on that, tell people that's what you're known for, target those people that need that. And I think there's a really interesting thing now that sort of says, actually, as we look at evolving challenges and technology taking stuff over, the kind of thing you're talking about is sort of you're putting a stall out there and people can kind of go, actually, I think you could also help us with this. And I think that's it's a much smarter thing, because otherwise you could find yourself promoting something that might not resonate with people because you're engaging with humans. And I think it's a much more human thing to say, actually, there's a core sort of skill set that I have here, but actually let's work out together how I can help you. And I think in what you do, if they think you can help them, chances are you can, because that'll be based on experience of having spent time with you and had you solve a particular problem. And so this idea that you would sort of pigeon yourself in a sort of like, Phil just does this, I think is really like, it's not smart from a sustainability perspective, but it's not solving a client problem. It just doesn't seem to me to be very human. And so I'm delighted when you talk in those terms, because I sort of have a similar thing, which is kind of like, if people, because you're not doing brain surgery or something or air traffic control where technical skills really, really matter. This is about how can I help people? How can I inspire them? How can I get them to think differently? And so you need to connect with them on a human level. And that doesn't necessarily sit in a little marketing box.
No. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's also kind of an intellectual honesty with it as well. Like, let's use one of the examples that I have spent most of my career, certainly, the last 15 years helping people with, which is, let's call it workplace stress. People are stressed. Stress seems to be part of the, almost the collective given experience. And so when I started helping people manage their stress, I was primarily using some of the tools I'd learned as a hypnotherapist. So a lot of it was grounded in physiological regulation, taking the nervous system and being able to down-regulate your cortisol levels, your adrenaline levels, things like norepinephrine, such that your body went into more of a parasympathetic dominance, and suddenly, there you go, stress managed, right? But then, of course, the more organizations I work with, I realize, well, actually, it has to be more than that. one of the primary sources of stress for people is their workload. So if I'm going to rock up and be genuinely helpful to people, I can't just teach them how to regulate their breathing, because they'll get back to their desk and they'll go, yeah, but what about all of these? What about my inbox? What about all these meetings I've got to navigate, right? What about these competing priorities? So then, being someone who's really good at helping people more productive, I'm suddenly infinitely more valuable. And again, more honest to go, look, if you're going to sustain your performance over time, i.e. be resilient, you have to be good at regulating your nervous system. You have to be good at regulating your emotions. You need to be able to do all that sort of stuff. But if you can't manage your workload, this isn't going to last very long. So then suddenly my resilience training became a bit of a two-parter: workload mastery and then self-mastery. But then you think, well, actually, if you're going to be resilient and sustain your performance over time, you need to be able to solve problems, don't you? Otherwise, the very first bottleneck or obstacle, you could go into some sort of spiral, and you might better regulate your emotions and you might better kind of tick off some tasks. But what about that problem that you genuinely need to overcome? So again, resilience training, if it is sustaining high performance, you've got to involve things like creativity, problem solving, the ability to innovate. So suddenly you realize, oh, all of these things, they're just being honest. The human condition is complex. The challenges of the workplace are multifaceted. So marketers, yeah, if I go, look, I will teach you how to regulate your breath. Cool. Phil's the breath guy. But, well, I'm sorry, but our biggest challenge is we've just got too many inboxes. Oh, I can't help with that because my marketing consultant says, don't blur, muddy the water. I'm lucky because it's my kind of natural disposition is to be curious, right? To be learning lots of different domains, to have genuine curiosity. That is how I got into what I do. Like I said, I just wanted to understand about my own brain, about trying to decode the science of productivity, which instantly again became multifaceted. It wasn't just about, how can I improve focus each day, but well, to what degree will things like sleep affect that, or exercise, or again, my nervous system. I mean, we are complicated beings. So any legitimate, lasting support to help someone be happier or more effective or be a better leader or be more resilient, it has to take a multimodal, holistic approach to them, which involves, again, all of the things I've just listed and so much more.
Love it. Love it. I think that is the perfect positive note on which to finish. Before I let you go, Phil, remind people what the book is called, what your name is, how they can find you, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. Okay. So I'm Phil Dobson. I'm the author of the Brain Book, How to Think and Work Smarter. Brainworkshops.co.uk is my website. And if you want to connect on LinkedIn, well, just do a search, I suppose. If you type Phil Dobson or Brain Workshops into LinkedIn, you'll find me there. And I've recently started doing a cognitive leadership newsletter on LinkedIn. So again, tuck in as much or as little as you want. And yeah, always reach out and I'll be happy to have a conversation about any of the things that might have sparked your curiosity with this great conversation. So yeah, thanks, Christian.
Amazing. We will put links to all of those things in the show notes so they'll be able to find all of those things. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. You have this energy and passion for what you do that just comes across even in this digital format. So I've very much enjoyed it. Thank you for providing some food for thought, for reassuring me, and also I think for just doing something that's incredibly valuable. And I hope more people get access to what you do in the way you think, because I think you can genuinely help people through what are, I won't say unprecedentedly difficult times, because as you pointed out earlier, I'm sure life before was tough. We're just in interesting times. Let's use that Chinese proverb. But thank you for all of that. But above all, thank you for being an amazing guest on the show.
Thank you, Christian. I've loved the conversation. It's been a great chat. Let's pick it up again sometime. I'd more than happily carry on this conversation. I think you and I could probably talk for many, many hours given the right conditions.
I have no
let's make it happen. Thank you again.
Brilliant. So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Phil for appearing. To find out more about Phil, his company, Brain Workshops, and the Brain Book, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. And remember, as Phil points out, there's often a big difference between being productive and being effective. I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.